Right. So that gets us to the first claim, right? And it is a contradiction to say that God is sovereign and God is good in view of all the evil in the world. So classically, this is known as the problem of evil. Right? Yeah. How can a good God allow for evil in the world, right? Especially if he is sovereign, right? And that sort of thing.
So in the past, this argument has been frequently made. Books have been written, counter books have been written, counter books have been written, counter book. Pretty much you can go back to, humanity has dealt with this question from whatever beginning that you come to understand. You have to kind of look at this world and go, okay, why did Ugg get killed by the saber-toothed tiger? Or why did the tower fall upon these people? Are they worse off than me? Is there something that designed them? In the comic explosion of the universe, was this always predestined to fall so that we had to make certain choices that only appear to be choices, but they're not really, that it's determined, and that tower fell because it was from the moment of the Big Bang to the heat death of the universe, that's what was designed to happen. There's no way to avoid it. Okay, well, we have to come to this understanding, and so it's been talked about, and so it seems odd here that Ehrman is using a platform where he's the textual critic, the critiquing of Jesus, the critiquing of the Bible, to kind of make this philosophical point. It's an odd step where, well, we agree you're a good scholar, but why should we listen to you in this respect?
And you're philosophical, meandering.
Yeah. However, most philosophers, both religious and secular, now realize that while there is a mystery in the relationship between God and evil, no internal dilemma threatens the rationality of the belief in God. So we kind of looked at this when it came to keeping faith in the age of reason with Jason Lyle. And so sometimes when people say there's a contradiction, well, they don't actually mean a contradiction. They just mean I don't agree with it, or here's an objection to it. Well, okay, you can come up with objections, but it doesn't mean that there's by saying A, you're also saying not A. There isn't that contradiction, that philosophical understanding of what a contradiction is.
Right. And so that's part of the issue here, right? The argument against God's sovereignty and goodness in the face of all evil in the world is self-contradictory. Right. So you're claiming it's a contradiction, but actually it's a self-contradiction. It assumes an absolute moral framework that is inconsistent with a worldview in which God is absent. So it's self-defeating, right? There's an absolute standard. Where does the standard come from? Well, it comes from God. Well, God doesn't exist, so you don't have an absolute standard. So we have an absolute standard that's not an absolute standard. Right. That's a contradiction, right? So an argument from the existence of evil to non-existence of God depends on establishing first that suffering indeed is evil. Right? You got to establish that first. But this is not an empirical observation. I just don't look at the kids, dip the cat's tail in gasoline and then strike a match to it, right? And say, evil, evil, evil. No, all I see is the cat's tail being dipped into the gasoline and a match being set to it. Right. The evil is a moral judgment. It's not an empirical observation, right? So suffering, by the way, under this worldview is natural. For it to be evil, a moral framework has to be presupposed. Right. We have to bring morality into the particular action. Right. Maybe
evolution will guide cats into not having tails to be lit on fire. And this cat just didn't survive that survival process.
That's an ugly. But I just saw your cat. So
I'd be okay with lighting his tail on fire sometimes. So I think what this thing tries to do as well is it tries to start out as an internal critique, but sadly moves to an external critique right away. And so if you're going to internally critique something, you want to be kind of adopting of that worldview for the sake of the argument,
and consistently keep that worldview.
Right. And so this one, it tries, but it ultimately fails by going outside of the bounds of the internal critique. So depends on establishing the suffering is indeed evil, but this is an empirical observation. It's a moral judgment. So you're kind of assuming what you're arguing. You're begging the question in this sense here. And then we come to the second one. Well, it assumes, for lack of a better word, a God's eye view.
Oh, okay.
The problem is
so we can see, down on everything else that's happening, right? Kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. So this is clearly suffering. This person is cutting this person open.
Yeah.
Was that person a serial killer or is it a surgeon? Hold on, let me go find out. Yeah. So the problem is that no human has this God's eye view. It can't look at everything. It can't say, well, this was suffering and evil. Child dies of cancer, but then the father goes on to invent the cure for cancer. Well, is that suffering good? Maybe. I mean, it prevented less suffering in the end. So isn't that what we're trying to do? Presenting
Again,
less
who knows,
suffering?
right? I mean,
What standard are we okay with killing the kid if it gets a cure for cancer? Kids die all the time. People die all the time. What's it matter about a kid or not a kid? Would it change if we had 2 kids? How about 3? How about 5? Ehrman says he can't think of a satisfying reason suffering exists, so there must not be a good reason. Thus, there must not be a God. But just because Ehrman, or any other person for that matter, can't understand why God would allow suffering doesn't mean that God doesn't exist.
Right.
This kind of incredulity of, well, I can't think of a good reason. Well,
so therefore God doesn't exist.
Yeah,
right?
and so, well, what if I come up with that reason? Well, I don't like that reason. Okay, well, then it's just personal taste. But if there are reasons offered biblically, and we see that there are, Romans 9 especially is a big one that I tend to point to, it provides understanding of why there's suffering, why there's evil, and people have written about this. And so to just say, well, there aren't good reasons. Well, okay, explain why. Talk about these things, and then do it from consistently a standard that we can point to that say, okay, well, it seems like all these things are lining up perfectly. It's consistent within itself. The Christian worldview would say that it would falter, and you can't have a consistent worldview, that you have to assume a God, or by saying that there is a standard, it ultimately points to God as that standard. And so we kind of have to have more of the meat than the bone,
Yeah. So Erdman seems to agree with the biblical authors that suffering is something that, we cannot fully understand, but then makes the giant leap to say that if he cannot understand it, then there must not be an explanation.
Yeah, lack of imagination. That's right. All I say.
And of course, this is poor logic. One argument simply doesn't follow from the other. Just because I don't understand it doesn't mean that there is no explanation.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's not a good argument.